21-year-old Bruce Falconer had finally put his life on track. After dropping out of high school, Bruce enlisted in the Marine Corps at the age of 16. 5 years later, he earned the rank of sergeant and was looking forward to a new assignment in Yuma, Arizona. Granted 30 days leave prior to his transfer, Bruce returned to his home in Bismarck, North Dakota. Less than a month later, he and his childhood best friend, Timothy Jewell, mysteriously vanished. Days later, Bruce's car was found stuck in the mud in a rural area south of the city. Subsequent investigation determined that there was a high probability the two men had become trapped in the winter wilderness and may have succumbed to the elements. Despite countless searches, a slew of media coverage, and several pieces of evidence found at the scene, Bruce himself has never been located. In addition to Bruce Falconer, today's episode will also touch on the unsolved disappearances of Rebecca Reid, abducted from her Eugene, Oregon job in 1997, Robin Ellis, who vanished while working as a pizza delivery driver in Philadelphia in 2003, as well as Kathleen Haley, who disappeared from her Newport News, Virginia apartment in 2012, leaving behind a series of disturbing pieces of evidence which suggests that the 37-year-old may have been the victim of a targeted and violent assault. This is Trace Evidence, episode 182, The Vanishing of Bruce Falconer. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today's episode will be a little different as we'll examine 4 disappearances. Bruce Falconer from North Dakota, Rebecca Reid from Oregon, Robin Ellis from Pennsylvania, and Kathleen Haley from Virginia. I'll explain a little bit more about the episode after a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter @TraceEvPod, Instagram @TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate directly via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or email me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. In the 5 years that I've been working on Trace Evidence, there have been a lot of cases I've wanted to cover but couldn't. Whether it's a lack of evidence, knowledge of the victim, or severely limited information, there can be a lot of issues which result in a case not being addressed. For this holiday week, I decided to do things a little differently. Bruce Falconer's disappearance is a case I've always wanted to cover, though due to the fact that everyone associated with the case believes they know what happened, there aren't any major theories to discuss. So, in the absence of those theories, we'll look at the cases of Rebecca Reid, Robin Ellis, and Kathleen Haley, 3 women who vanished and, in the years since, have received little coverage and no major updates. This is episode 182. The Vanishing of Bruce Falconer. "12 miles south of Bismarck, cluttered city streets and bright lights of high-rise apartments fade away, replaced by an expansive wilderness hidden in the growing darkness of night. There, the Missouri River twists and turns through dense woods, open fields, sandy earth, and mud-bogged swampland. This isolated location is known by many names: the Bottomlands, Kimball Bottoms, and the desert. During the day, it draws in all types: hunters, hikers, four-wheelers, and dirt bike riders looking for fun and excitement away from the urban city center. At night, the isolated and somewhat treacherous spot is populated by a different group. Teenagers and adults come out to the faraway location to hang out with friends, lighting bonfires and sharing a few drinks in the orange glow without worrying about interruptions. You can see headlights coming for miles around. For the most part, it's a place filled with good memories and happy times, but for 2 families, it's the site of a decades-old grief and pain with a mystery at the heart of it. On a cold February night in 1981, 21-year-old Bruce Falconer and his childhood friend Timothy Jewell climbed into Bruce's new Chevy Blazer and made the 20-minute drive south in search of a quiet spot to reminisce about the old days and maybe share a few drinks. Bruce was on leave from the United States Marine Corps and would be returning for a new assignment in Arizona. Tim was back in school, putting the pieces together and looking to build a future and a new career. They had their whole lives in front of them, and they never could have imagined they'd never make it back home. Days later, investigators searching the rural area would find Bruce's prized Blazer stuck in the mud in a particularly isolated and dangerous spot. A few yards away from there lie the remnants of a campfire, a handful of cigarette butts, and a slew of unanswered questions. Had Bruce and Tim gotten lost after getting the Blazer stuck? Had they wandered disoriented and freezing through the night and fallen through the ice into the water? Or could they still be out there, lost somewhere in the more than 400 acres of difficult terrain wedged between the eroded and collapsing banks of the frigid Missouri River? Bruce Aaron Falconer was born on Thursday, July 16, 1959 in Bismarck, North Dakota, to parents Harry and Dorothy. At the time of his birth, Bruce had two older siblings, a brother and a sister, and just a few years later his parents would welcome another daughter. As a child, Bruce has been described as a caring and polite kid with a zest for adventure and a love of the outdoors. When Bruce was young, his parents separated and eventually divorced, and for the vast majority of his life he would be raised along with his siblings by Dorothy, who worked hard to support her children as a single mother. While Bruce's father didn't leave North Dakota, he doesn't appear to have been much involved in his children's lives, eventually settling on a family farm south of Bismarck and moving through several different careers. By his teen years, Bruce had grown into an intelligent and charismatic young man who made friends with ease, and he was noted as having an entertaining and kind personality. Bruce had the type of mind where, whatever he put it to, he could accomplish, and he was frequently praised for his hard work and dedication to the goal at hand. Unfortunately, his interest had never really locked in on education, with his primary focus being on working with his hands. He was particularly drawn to and skilled at both carpentry and mechanics. Though Bruce went on to attend Bismarck High School, he wouldn't stick with it. His mother would later tell the Tribune that while he was a smart teenager, his inattentiveness and distaste for formal education resulted in him always falling behind his fellow students. In 1976, during his sophomore year, Bruce made the decision to drop out of school at the age of 16. Now, faced with entering the working world, he would move through several different jobs without really finding something that captured his passion. Bruce continued to live at home with his mother, though Dorothy made it clear that while he could live there, she'd provide him with financial help to go to school, but she wouldn't be giving him money to go out with his friends, buy clothes, or anything else. That would be up to him, as while he wasn't yet legally an adult, if he wasn't going to finish his high school education, then he needed to be able to earn and spend his own money. After some discussion regarding his future plans, Bruce brought up the possibility of enlisting in the military. According to Dorothy, she thought this was a good idea as it could provide him with an education, he could learn a trade, and it wouldn't cost him anything. In fact, he'd be getting paid for his time in the service, and overall, this was viewed as a win-win situation. On Tuesday, December 28, 1976, Bruce officially enlisted in the United States Marine Corps with his mother's full approval. According to Dorothy, the Marine Corps seemed to provide just what Bruce needed: discipline, routine, structure, and opportunity. She later explained to the Tribune, quote, "He had some problems in his younger years, but he really got straightened out in the Marines. He was more mature and straight in how he dealt with things." End quote. While in the Marines, Bruce studied for and obtained his GED, granting him more options in regard to how he'd proceed with his career. While education still wasn't his top priority, he developed an interest in physical fitness and would go on to study martial arts, earning himself a black belt. Beyond that, he began spending time in the gym lifting weights and found he had acquired an interest in pursuing bodybuilding. This in turn caused Bruce to be more aware of his eating and exercise habits, wanting to keep his body clean and healthy. Bruce had been sent to basic training at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, California, And less than a year later, in August of '77, Bruce obtained the rank of Private First Class while serving with the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, also known as 29 Palms, in southern San Bernardino County. Over the course of the next few years, Bruce continued to develop his career in the Marine Corps and acquired a taste for it. According to military enlistment records, following the conclusion of his first term with the Marines, Bruce re-enlisted in July of '79. He'd go on to attend Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Warfare School in Alabama, where he was responsible for ensuring that his unit was properly trained and ready for any possibility. Dorothy later stated that Bruce found this all very fascinating and was highly focused on the procedures and protocols. In early 1981, Bruce was stationed at Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, where he'd be promoted to the rank of sergeant. Extremely proud of his promotion, Bruce was excited about his future prospects with the Marine Corps, though his time in North Carolina would be coming to an end. He was prepping to be transferred to the Marine Corps Air Station in Yuma, Arizona. This was a highly sought-after post, as many noted the agreeable weather, a less strict environment for soldiers, and access to vastly more extensive recreational facilities. Bruce was granted 30 days leave and left Camp Lejeune to return home to Bismarck to visit family and friends. At the conclusion of those 30 days, Bruce was scheduled to arrive in Yuma, but he would tragically disappear before that could happen. Back in Bismarck in February of 1981, Bruce stayed with his mother and spent a lot of his free time catching up with friends, spending time with his family, and making plans for his transfer. Dorothy told the Tribune that they'd had a lot of conversations about Arizona, whether he should fly or drive, what belongings he should bring with him, what he should leave for temporary storage with his mother, and what he should move into long-term storage. In a touching moment, Dorothy recalled how she had sewn his new sergeant chevrons onto his uniform, and how very proud he was of the direction his military career was taking. Bruce spent a lot of time with his family during leave, wanting to be more involved in their lives. According to Dorothy, an avid jogger at the time, Bruce used his knowledge of working out and training to teach her the best way to run in order to avoid straining muscles or injuring herself. He also offered advice on what to eat to stay in better shape and develop muscle, with his mother referring to him as having become a health food nut. He was no longer the directionless 16-year-old who had left home 5 years earlier. He was 21, and he knew exactly how he wanted to spend the rest of his life. Bruce would go on to purchase a vehicle, a four-wheel drive Chevy Blazer, blue with a white top. He applied his knowledge and love of mechanics to fixing up the Blazer to his own specifications, putting a lot of money into the overhaul. As a result, towards the end of the month, he was running low on cash, but that didn't seem to impede his plans. He'd spent a lot of time catching up with old friends, but there was one in particular he kept missing: his best friend, 20-year-old Tim Jewell. The two had grown close during their early school days and had kept in touch while Bruce traveled with the Marines. Similar to Bruce, Tim had also dropped out of high school at 16 and found himself aimlessly searching for direction. When Bruce went away to basic training, Tim remained in Bismarck and found himself in trouble from time to time before eventually deciding that the best way to put his life back in order would be to return to education. After obtaining his GED, Tim enrolled in night courses at Bismarck Junior College before going on to attend full-time. Working as a volunteer at the YMCA, Tim took an interest in athletics and began making plans to pursue a career as a coach or gym teacher. While financially, he didn't have the money necessary to go for his bachelor's degree at full speed, his mother, Arlene, would later tell the Tribune, quote, "He was taking it just one step at a time. He was finally getting to do what he wanted." End quote. On the evening of Friday, February 20th, Bruce and Tim would finally get in touch, and the two decided to go out for a night on the town. According to authorities, Bruce drove over to Tim's home in Bismarck and picked him up with the Blazer. The two old friends bounced around the downtown area, hitting different bars and having a good time. At one point, both men showed up at Dorothy's South 3rd Street apartment, where they ran into Bruce's younger sister, Kelly. At the time, Dorothy was out of town attending a wedding in California. According to his sister, Bruce was in good spirits that night, as was Tim, and there didn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary. After spending a short time refreshing at the apartment, the two friends headed back out at approximately 8:30 p.m. They arrived at the Dockside Lounge, a bar housed inside of a now defunct Holiday Inn along US 10 at Memorial Bridge, just 2 miles west of the 13th Street home where Tim lived with his mother and just north of Dorothy's apartment. According to investigators, Bruce and Tim remained at the bar until closing time, which occurred at approximately 1:30 a.m. After leaving the bar, the two decided against heading home for the night and instead began a 20-minute drive to Kimball Bottom, an area known locally as the Desert. Approximately 13 miles south of Bismarck, the Missouri River curves sharply to the east before swinging back west and turning north, passing through a rural area comprised of more than 400 acres of both swamp and dry sandy land. At the time, this was a popular out-of-the-way location where young people would get together to hang out, lighting bonfires and drinking far from the lights of the city and the eyes of anyone who might be aiming to put an end to their good time. Presumably, Bruce and Tim headed this way to continue drinking while most of the bars in town were closing. Behind the wheel of his new Blazer, Bruce felt they could easily maneuver through the difficult terrain, but this may have been a serious underestimation, as neither man would make it back home. No one saw or heard from either man over the weekend, and when Dorothy spoke to her daughter, she was informed that Bruce hadn't been home since Friday evening, and immediately she knew something was wrong. This was a sentiment shared by Tim's mother, who acknowledged that as soon as she realized he was missing, she believed something terrible must have happened to him, as he always kept in touch and had never gone out for days at a time without notifying her of where he was and when he'd be back. On Tuesday, February 24th, 4 days after either man had been seen, both Arlene and Dorothy filed missing persons reports with the Burleigh County Sheriff's Department. During the initial investigation, sheriff's detectives worked to determine where Bruce and Tim may have gone and whether or not they might have elected to go off somewhere on their own without telling anyone. Friends and family were fairly quick to shut down those possibilities. Unsure of what they were facing, but feeling fairly certain that neither Bruce or Tim were in Bismarck, the sheriff's department began organizing a massive search which would focus in on the more than 10 square miles of the bottomland near the Missouri River. The search launched on the morning of Wednesday, February 25th, and was conducted by the sheriff's department as well as the Bismarck police. Dozens of officers began searching the treacherous terrain on foot, horseback, and with all-terrain vehicles. The National Guard joined the search, sending a helicopter which would scan the bottoms from the sky in hopes that any trace of the two men could be found. Not long after taking flight, members of the helicopter crew spotted Bruce's blue Chevy Blazer in a location approximately a mile north of the Missouri River, not far from the Morton County line. Notified about the spot, investigators began converging on the location in search of Bruce, Tim, or any evidence they could find. Detectives would later describe the location of the Blazer as being a boggy area thick with mud that behaved similarly to quicksand, not far from a 10-foot riverbank. When they approached the vehicle, they found the tires sunken into the mud, though there was no major damage to the body. The Blazer was locked when found, and investigators determined that, upon getting stuck in the mud, both Bruce and Tim had exited the vehicle in pursuit of assistance or possibly to wait until morning to try and free the vehicle. According to investigators, the Blazer had gas in the tank, but couldn't be started, and they quickly determined this was due to the fact that the spark plugs were wet. Now that they had found the spot where Bruce and Tim had gotten stuck, search efforts began fanning out in wider and wider circles to cover the area surrounding the Blazer in search of any signs of which way they may have gone. Several yards north, investigators came upon the remnants of a campfire, surrounded by cigarette butts matching the brand that Bruce smoked. Detectives theorized that, after getting stuck, the two men had stepped down from the vehicle into 18 inches of water and then built a fire to warm up and dry off. With it being late February, temperatures overnight peaked at 40 degrees, dropping into the low 30s over the next few hours. Strong winds sweeping in from the northwest would have made the area even more difficult to endure, especially since both men would have been wet by the nearly freezing waters. Neither man was dressed for the treacherous weather either, with Bruce wearing a lined jean jacket and corduroy pants, while Tim wore a down-filled vest and blue jeans. Due to the extreme nature of the situation, there was a good chance one or both men had decided to try and hike out of the area in search of help, as the alternative would likely have resulted in hypothermia and possibly death. According to investigators, at that time of night, only two sources of light could be seen from the area, one originating from a farm several miles to the north, and another from a home across the river in the community of Huff, several miles to the southeast. Had Bruce and Tim gone north, they might have had a chance, but heading south towards Huff would require crossing the Missouri River, which, while iced over, was far from safe or stable. Unfortunately, by the evening of Friday the 27th, 2 days after the search had begun, investigators noted that they had neither found any indication of which direction the two men may have gone, nor did they locate any evidence to suggest foul play may have been involved. Richard Peck, assistant Burleigh County Sheriff, told the Tribune that after 3 days of intensive searching, they hadn't turned up any new or helpful clues, and at that time, they issued a statewide bulletin with Bruce and Tim's descriptions, banking on the possibility that they may have managed to hike out of the area and could be lost or in need of medical assistance elsewhere. At the time, the Sheriff's Department noted that while they hadn't yet found anything of investigative value, they weren't planning to call off the searches anytime soon. On Monday, March 2nd, Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Thiessen of the Sheriff's Department and another deputy crisscrossed the rural area on horseback, covering approximately 35 miles. They searched through any area where the men may have gone to seek shelter, including but not limited to hollow logs and deadfalls, a term used to describe large, tangled masses of fallen trees and brush. Thiessen was operating under the assumption that, were Bruce and Tim out there somewhere in the open, they would have been found by now, after a conversation he'd had with the National Guard helicopter pilot. Thiessen explained to the Tribune, quote, "The pilot told me he could even see deer lying down in thick brush. If they were like other people, they wandered around in the dark for a while. If they did, they would have stepped in about 18 inches of water. They built a campfire to dry out, and it's like they went up in smoke." End quote. Asked about the possibility that Bruce and Tim may have drowned, falling into the water they couldn't see in the pitch-black darkness, Thiessen was dismissive, noting that the waters closest to the blazer were flowing just under 4 feet. It was more likely that, if indeed they fell into the water, it would have been due to walking along the riverbank, which was severely eroded. The ground there was unstable, and it wouldn't take much pressure to cause a collapse, which could have dropped them into the river, possibly even burying them in the collapse. At the time, investigators weren't certain that either man was still out in that area, feeling that by now they'd have found some trace of them, and so they began turning their attention towards a number of tips that had been called in by locals. Thiessen later told the Tribune that the Marine Corps had sent orders to Bruce at his mother's apartment, though he hadn't been there to receive them, and that a paycheck was waiting for him in Minot, 130 miles north of Bismarck, but he hadn't picked it up and he couldn't obtain it without bringing the orders with him. On Friday, March 6th, the Sheriff's Department issued a statement requesting the assistance of locals in finding Bruce and Tim. Sergeant Myron Hindley stated that, at the time, they had essentially exhausted every avenue they possibly could and were open to suggestion. Along with this request for information, the Sheriff's Department issued descriptions of the two men. Bruce was described as being a white male with short blonde hair and brown eyes, standing 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 147 pounds. Bruce was last seen wearing a pile-lined blue jean jacket, a tan shirt with braid trim, white corduroy pants, and brown and white cowboy boots. Tim was described as being a white male with light brown hair, a short beard, and blue eyes, standing 6 foot 1.5 and weighing 200 pounds. He was last seen wearing a light blue long-sleeve velour shirt, a light blue down vest, blue jeans, and brown boots. Following up on several tips they had received, the Sheriff's Department spent the next few weeks searching for any possible sighting of the men. Unfortunately, all of the tips they'd gotten led to dead ends, and as more time passed, rumors began circulating that the men had been involved in a drug deal gone bad, or that they'd murdered someone and fled to Canada. All of this, Lieutenant Colonel Thiessen would later explain, was nothing more than wild speculation, and they hadn't found a single piece of evidence to connect either man to any illegal behavior. Regardless, they had to track down the information they were given, taking away valuable time and energy, which may have been better suited to additional search efforts. On Saturday, March 28th, more than a month after either Bruce or Tim had been seen, Burleigh County Sheriff Bob Harvey organized a group of 25 searchers from his department, the Bismarck Police, and the Bismarck Police Posse. On foot, horseback, and ATVs, the group's search began nearest to where the blazer had been found, before expanding outward to cover an area encompassed in the 10-square-mile block. For the first time publicly, Harvey acknowledged that there was an increasing likelihood that the two men might be dead, but he also noted, following several dozen tips they'd received, there was always the chance they were alive and weren't in the Bottomlands area. Harvey stated that they'd originally considered calling in locals for assistance with the searches, but due to the danger of the area and his small number of officers, he didn't believe they could safely keep an eye on everyone, and he didn't want someone else getting lost or hurt. Harvey also noted that State Game and Fish Warden Patrick Hedrick had been conducting his own searches for the men in the area all throughout the previous month, but much like his officers, he hadn't found any clues or pieces of evidence to show what may have happened. The following day, Sunday, March 29th, Sheriff Harvey reported that their search, which had lasted several hours, was called off when no traces of Bruce or Tim were found. While investigators had initially been dismissive of the possibility that the two men may have fallen into the river, Sheriff Harvey acknowledged the chance, telling the Tribune, quote, "I can't guarantee they didn't go through the ice," end quote. Harvey noted that if they had walked towards the light to the south in Huff, they easily could have fallen into the river, either due to being lost in the dark or by walking along the loose soil of the riverbank. According to Harvey, they hadn't yet focused their searches on the river itself because they had no evidence to show the men had walked towards it, so they continued to focus on the Bottomlands area. The entire department had grown frustrated by the lack of results and leads, with Harvey stating, quote, "We've run into a stone wall. We have to draw the assumption they're in there someplace, and if they are in that area, they are no longer alive," end quote. At this point, investigators acknowledged that the case was growing cold. 5 weeks later, on Thursday, May 7th, Burleigh County deputies launched a search focusing in on a wetland area south of Bismarck, though the exact location was not specified. According to Sheriff Harvey, 3 deputies searched for nearly 4 hours in the area where it was possible that Bruce or Tim's bodies may have washed out of the river. This search did not turn up any sign of either man, though, with investigators noting this was but one of several spots where a body could be expelled from the water. Asked if they would continue to search, Sheriff Harvey stated that they did have multiple searches planned and they'd continue to search until the men were found, saying, quote, "We have to. It's just a matter of time before they're found," end quote. 1 month later, in early June, the Sheriff's Department published a hand-drawn map in local newspapers, which broke down the Bottomlands area into a grid mapped out in 1-square-mile blocks. The map noted the location of the blazer, the Missouri River, the entrance to the desert, and other important details. Aside from publishing the map, Sheriff Harvey noted physical copies were available for distribution at the sheriff's office and the county courthouse. He implored local hunters and fishermen who would be going out into that area following the spring thaw to keep their eyes peeled for any evidence that might be connected to the 2 missing men. If you're listening in the Vodacast app, you can see this map right now. The link is in the show notes. After sharing the map, the search for Bruce and Tim continued to grow cold. In August, which marked 6 months since the 2 men vanished, the Sheriff's Department only issued a small update, noting that the case had not progressed much, and after discovery of the blazer, they still had not come upon any new evidence. In addition to this, Sheriff Harvey reported that while they'd received dozens of tips in the weeks and months following the disappearance, those tips had begun to trickle out, and they hadn't received a call in regard to Bruce or Tim in months. 3 months later in November, the situation had not improved. hoping that maybe, in a way they could not understand, Bruce and Tim were alive out there somewhere. Both of their names were added to the NCIC computer system. 9 months had passed by this point, and there had been no sighting of the two, nor had there been any additional information or evidence gathered. Asked about keeping the case open and whether or not they believed Bruce and Tim were possibly alive, Sheriff Harvey told the Tribune, quote, "We don't close out any of them until they're finished. We're still spending a lot of time on the case. It has to be done. We're going on the assumption that they're dead. It just doesn't seem very logical that two guys just up, walk away, and disappear." End quote. Sadly, the holiday season would come and go, and 1981 would end with neither Bruce's mother nor Tim's having any answers. And with the 1-year anniversary coming up, it began to seem as though they may never know the fate of their sons. In the days leading up to February 20th, which marked a year since Bruce and Tim vanished out in the desert, a series of articles brought the case back into the spotlight, discussing the investigation over the previous year. According to the Sheriff's Department, their case file on the missing men was beyond an inch thick and filled with the results of searches, tips which had been called in, and a number of leads that had been tracked down and failed to deliver any helpful information. Lieutenant Colonel Thiessen noted that over the previous 12 months, he had personally led nearly 24 searches, which had been conducted on foot, ATV, horseback, helicopter, and an airplane loaned out by the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Identification. They'd even utilized watercrafts supplied by the Game and Fish Department. Beyond Thiessen's official searches, many locals had done their own searches of the area, and other law enforcement agencies had offered their assistance and in some cases taken the initiative to organize their own searches. After all of those attempts, only a few new items had been recovered. Thiessen noted that a watch and several pieces of clothing had been found out in the wilderness, but they hadn't been able to link the items to Bruce or Tim, and since the area draws a lot of different people from the area to hike, hunt, and explore, they had no way of knowing if these items were connected or had been lost by someone else. At one point, a man from the area reported seeing fabric floating in the river, and Thiessen went out to the location, tying a rope around his waist and wading into the waters. Ultimately, he discovered the fabric was nothing more than a rag that had been kicked up out of the mud by the river's flow. According to Thiessen, they even had a psychic out in the area who believed she could lead them to Bruce and Tim, but when she wanted to walk across the ice, the hunt was called off as it was too dangerous to try and traverse the thin ice. Outside of searches, Thiessen reported that he frequently visited bars to speak with people who claimed to have information, although their reports always ran to dead ends. At least 5 John Doe bodies found in states across the country fit Bruce or Tim's descriptions, but dental records always proved that it was neither of the missing men. According to Thiessen and Sheriff Harvey, they weren't fully convinced yet that either man was out in the desert somewhere. If they'd fallen into the river and drowned, they felt they'd have found their bodies by now, but they also had to entertain the possibility that if they'd fallen in due to erosion and weak soil, they may have been buried beneath the earth and mud, possibly pinned to the river bottom. Thiessen noted that when he'd waded into the river, he'd felt large clumps of dirt beneath the surface, thick boulders of soil which were not broken up and had clearly fallen in. Thiessen also told the Tribune that the Sheriff's Department, as well as him personally, were frustrated and annoyed by rumors being circulated in the area. Asked about this, Dorothy stated that she believed her son was likely in the desert, having fallen through the ice and drowned. She too expressed frustration with the rumors, explaining that they'd been especially hard on her daughter, saying, quote, "She was a senior in high school, and you know how kids in high school are. Every day she would hear it from other kids who had heard their parents talking. The kids would be talking about it every place they went and at parties because it was all very mysterious. I got a lot of phone calls too, with rumors." End quote. Reluctantly, Arlene tended to agree with Dorothy that their sons had likely fallen into the river or had died due to exposure, but she didn't think they'd made it out of the bottomlands. She explained, quote, "I guess I believe they're still down there somewhere. I thought if they had fallen in the river, their bodies would have surfaced in the spring, but the banks along the river did a lot of caving in last year. and I think they might be buried under one." End quote. While investigators didn't want to be very specific about what they thought was the most likely scenario, it was noted that they didn't have reason to believe either Bruce or Tim would have run off. Bruce surely wouldn't have left behind his new vehicle, and he had a bright future in the Marines that he was looking forward to. After he failed to arrive in Arizona, Bruce was listed as absent without leave. After a month of no contact, his status was changed to that of a deserter, as it's military protocol when a soldier can't be located. Master Gunnery Sergeant Paul Thompson told the Tribune that Bruce would remain listed as a deserter until he or his body were found. The Sheriff's Department held a press conference on the 20th to keep the case fresh in the minds of the public, and with the slim hope that someone with information might yet come forward. Both mothers were invited, though only Dorothy attended, as Arlene still found it too painful to discuss in such a public forum. Asked about her son, Dorothy explained that she wanted to know the truth, saying, quote, "I'd like to know one way or the other. I still have all his stuff in my apartment, and it's a very small apartment. I still have his income tax refund from last year, and I had to file for him this year. There's so many loose ends. I'm more organized than that. I know it may sound bad, and it sounds like I want to hear my son is dead, but I want to know something. It's something I'll never forget. I'm glad you're writing about it. I want people to know about it because if it's fresh in their minds, they may see or hear something." End quote. Sadly, after a year, the case was ice cold, and detectives began to believe they would likely never find out what truly happened. 5 long years would pass before there was another press conference or briefing from the Sheriff's Department, and while their families would never forget, their lives had to keep moving forward. In February of 1987, 6 years after the last time anyone saw either man alive, Sheriff Harvey managed to obtain a small reward fund. Approaching county commissioners, he was faced with the typical red tape as they tried to determine what budget to draw the money from, and reportedly Sheriff Harvey told them they could take it right out of his own salary. Eventually, however, they managed to put together $2,500, but the county put limitations on that reward. It would only be available for a year, and it would need to be paid out only if information led directly to the men, alive or dead. 3 months earlier, in December of 1986, the United States government officially declared Bruce Falconer deceased. His mother was issued an official death certificate, and his life insurance paid out its policy. She acknowledged that her son was more than likely gone, but she expressed her appreciation for the Sheriff's Department, which had never given up. Even in the previous years, they'd launched several searches of the area, though always to no avail. Asked about this, Sheriff Harvey explained, quote, "We still go down there. All that is still going on. I'm serious about this. These people have sat out there for 6 years without answers." End quote. Unfortunately, without finding more, there was little they could do to either offer comfort to the families or rectify the case with Harvey, noting his beliefs that, in all likelihood, the file would probably never be officially closed. He went on to state his belief that the men had fallen through the ice that night, and while no bodies had ever been found, he said there were many possibilities as to why, saying they could have been buried in a riverbank collapse or become tangled up with something beneath the surface. Tim's mother, Arlene, speaking to the Tribune, addressed issues she had been facing over the previous years. The stress and grief of not knowing led her to be hospitalized for ulcer surgery twice, and she struggled with depression. Finally, she decided to move out of her apartment and into a mobile home, and under a doctor's advice, was trying to get out more and have some semblance of a life. According to her, she had turned down the offer of holding a public memorial service for Tim, noting that he could not be legally declared dead until the next year, 1988, and she saw no reason to rush the process. Dorothy, too, had turned down an offer for a memorial service, explaining she wouldn't hold one until Bruce was found, saying, quote, "Why should I make my friends grieve for me? When I pick up his uniform and his stuff, he's still there." End quote. Another year passed with no new information, and in February of 1988, the $2,500 reward expired. After so many years of not knowing, Tim was legally declared dead that same month. His mother organized and held a memorial service for him at Faith Lutheran Church, unsure of how to say goodbye to someone when, in the back of your mind, you're always wondering, could he still be alive out there somewhere, or is that little more than a pipe dream? 5 more years would pass before Arlene finally got an answer. On Thursday, February 4th, 1993, Sheriff Bob Harvey announced at a press conference that his department was investigating the discovery of human remains in the Missouri River bottom. At the time, they were unable to confirm an identification and were awaiting the result of forensic tests. 8 weeks later, in mid-April, Sheriff Harvey announced that testing had confirmed the remains found were those of Timothy Jewell. According to the sheriff, a lone hunter reported discovering a human skull in late December of 1992. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found other bones, and after 5 days of digging through the sand and mud, they managed to recover a nearly complete human skeleton. In addition to the bones, they also found shreds of clothing, a necklace, and a cigarette lighter. Working in conjunction with a local oral surgeon and a forensic anthropologist at the University of North Dakota, they were able to identify the remains as belonging to Tim, and according to the official reports, the bones showed no evidence of foul play. No bullet wounds, knife wounds, or even broken bones. While the condition of the remains made it difficult to determine a cause of death, it was ultimately ruled that Tim had died of natural causes, likely due to drowning or exposure. Sheriff Harvey said that the remains had been found approximately 1.5 miles from Highway 1804 and 1.5 miles from the river, essentially in a space between the highway and where Bruce's Blazer had been located. The remains were found in an area of dense reeds which, at the time of the men's disappearance, had been beneath the water. Over the previous 7 years, though, an intense drought had uncovered a lot of spaces that couldn't be searched previously. Arlene went on to hold a funeral for Tim, and Dorothy attended, though she later admitted to sobbing during the service, wondering if Bruce would ever be found. Unfortunately, as of this episode, 40 years have passed since Bruce was last seen alive, and not a trace of him has ever been located. While it's been incredibly difficult on both families, Tim's family was able to receive some form of closure and the ability to properly lay him to rest. For Bruce's family, while they fully believe that he too likely died out there in the desert after falling into the river, the uncertainty of it all is always lingering. Dorothy tries to make the best life she can, knowing Bruce would want her to go on. She kept many of his belongings, and his military medals are displayed in her home. She sees Bruce and her grandsons, remembers him through photographs and stories, and hopes someday to have the ability to give him a proper burial. She asks little of those who would tell her son's story, other than the simple request that they tell the true story and distance themselves from unnecessary dramatization and the sensationalism of unwarranted rumors. I hope to have lived up to that request. There doesn't appear to have been a search for Bruce in quite some time, and with the shifting of the river, the coming and going of droughts, and the environmental changes which come naturally over 4 decades, there remains the possibility that Bruce will someday be found and brought home. His family deserves that closure, and Bruce deserves the honor, pomp, and circumstance of a military funeral. He loved his career in the Marine Corps, and perhaps someday, Dorothy will see her son laid to rest as the soldier he was so proud to be. Asked about the pain of the loss, Dorothy chooses to focus on the positive, saying, quote, "My family and I don't dwell on the disappearance. We remember Bruce's life, his personality, and his accomplishments." Sadly, it seems, the most likely reality is that Bruce Falconer, like his friend Tim Jewell, died somewhere in the bottomlands that cold February night. While his remains have never been found, neither his family nor investigators believe there's any possibility of foul play or that Bruce is anywhere out there alive. In the absence of theories to discuss, we'll move on to our next case, the disappearance of Rebecca Reid. Rebecca Kathleen Thompson was born on Thursday, December 17, 1959, to parents Basil and Maxine in Springfield, a city in Lane County, approximately 100 miles south of Portland, Oregon. Rebecca, or Becky as she was known to those close to her, was the second-born daughter, having an older sister named Chris. Sweet and kind, Becky has been referred to by family and friends as a loving person with a bubbly personality who almost always was laughing and smiling whether times were good or bad. She attended Thurston High School where she performed well academically as well as being heavily involved in extracurricular activities. She was a cheerleader for several years, belonging to a handful of student groups, and she also played field hockey. Becky graduated in the spring of 1978, and 2 years later, in February of 1980, she married for the first time. This marriage, however, was not built to last, as Becky became a bride 10 months before her 21st birthday and divorced 3 months before her 22nd. In 1981, Becky was working at the grocery cart, a small convenience store, when she met and began a relationship with Reid. 2 years later, in January of 1983, the couple married, and not long after, they celebrated the birth of their son. According to friends and family, the relationship between the couple was good, for the most part, although there were some difficult times. Multiple state records show that in 1991, 8 years into their marriage, a divorce petition was filed. 3 years after that, in 1994, local records show the issuance of a second marriage license between Becky and Daryl. It seemed, while there had been a time of struggle between them, they were ultimately drawn back together. The two had been together in one form or another for nearly 20 years. They raised their son, by that time a teenager, with Becky's sister Chris Yoder later noting how much she loved him, saying, quote, "She was an awesome mom. I think she just felt like everything was so complete. Her marriage was good, she was happy, and she had this cute little redheaded boy." End quote. Sadly, one cold night in January of 1997, Becky would vanish at the hands of an unknown suspect. On the evening of Sunday, January 26th, Becky, now 37, was scheduled to work a late-night closing shift at the grocery cart, where she wouldn't be getting off until 1:30 a.m. Monday morning. At the time, Becky lived with her husband and son on Snyder Road in Junction City, just 6.5 miles northwest of the Eugene store. Sunday the 26th was a busy day for sports fans across the country, as it was the night of Super Bowl 31, taking place between the Patriots and Packers, though this didn't appear to have an impact on Becky's evening. According to everything released by investigators, the majority of Becky's work shift went off without anything out of the ordinary or any concerning incidents. All of that would change, however, in the lingering minutes before the store was set to close at 1 a.m. on Monday, January 27th. Just before 1 a.m., a male customer was arriving with a few bags of empty bottles he was planning to return for the deposit refund. However, rather than entering the store as he normally would, the customer found himself witnessing something disturbing. According to the Albany Democrat-Herald, this witness, who has never been publicly identified, saw an unknown man forcing Becky out of the store. The witness went on to say that the man was holding on to Becky's arm and was moving quickly, forcibly leading the store clerk towards his vehicle. He reported that Becky appeared out of it, describing her demeanor as seeming dazed. He went on to explain that the unknown man opened the passenger door of his truck and roughly shoved Becky inside head first. After the unknown man sped off, the witness dashed across the parking lot to a donut shop located next door. He quickly dialed 911 and reported the abduction to the Eugene Police Department, who dispatched officers to the scene. Upon arriving, detectives entered the store, at which time they noted that money was missing, though they've never specified how much had been taken. It was also revealed that while temperatures had been in the high 20s at the time, Becky's coat was found still hanging on a hook inside the building. In addition to that, the 37-year-old's Ford Bronco was still in the parking lot. Investigators determined that the suspect's initial motive had been robbery due to the missing cash, though they were uncertain why Becky had been taken, with their only thoughts being dark ones. Police Captain Jerry Smith referred to an employee being abducted during a robbery as out of the ordinary, saying that it only happened in rare instances. The witness, who had called police, was able to offer up a description of the suspect and his vehicle. The abductor was stated as being a white male, in his late 20s to mid-30s, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing between 165 and 185 pounds. The man had shoulder-length brown hair, a mustache, and an unshaven, stubbly face. At the time of the attack, the suspect was wearing a dark-colored baseball cap, a white shirt, and blue jeans. A composite would later be sketched and circulated showing this assailant. You can see it now in the Vodacast app. The link is in the show notes. The suspect's vehicle was described as being a white or light-colored compact or mid-size pickup truck, late 70s or early 80s model. An 8-inch wide horizontal blue racing stripe ran down the driver's side of the truck. The truck may have had a white canopy top at the height of the cab covering the bed. The truck did not have an extended cab or slider, and it appeared as though the cab held a bench seat. If the witness saw which direction the truck traveled after leaving the store, that information has never been released. The following day, on Tuesday, January 28th, investigators asked the public for their assistance in locating the suspect and Becky. Her husband, Daryl, spoke to the papers, saying, quote, "Becky, if you're watching and able to watch, we love you. And if people have information at all, please contact police. Our prayers are with you." End quote. Daryl was of the belief that the abductor may or may not have been happy with the low amount of money in the store and possibly had taken Becky in order to hold her for a higher ransom. As a result, he made it clear that he was waiting by the phone for a call, but that call never came. Detective Sergeant Rick Gilliam later told the Statesman Journal, quote, "The longer we go without her surfacing, the less optimistic we are. We're just hoping that she turns up alive." End quote. Inside of the first weeks, investigators received dozens of tips from callers who claimed to have seen either the truck or their suspect, though none of them claimed to have seen Becky. While tips continued to pour in, they always seemed to lead to dead ends, either being misidentifications of the suspect or the truck. And while police interviewed everyone whose name was given, they couldn't locate anyone who might have been involved. Within just a few weeks, the case had begun growing cold, despite the involvement of the FBI. By March, 2 months had passed with no leads on Becky. Hoping that national attention could help break the case, America's Most Wanted ran a segment early in March. While this resulted in additional calls, again, investigators found only dead ends and misidentified suspects. By the summer, despite Becky's family's attempts to keep her story alive, the abduction had fallen from the headlines, and police lacked the manpower to keep detectives working her case exclusively. 5 years later, in 2002, the sentencing of 37-year-old John Irva Dunn brought Becky's name back into the headlines. In February of '97, less than a month after Becky's abduction, Dunn had entered a grocery store in Eugene and brandished a knife on a female cashier. According to court records, Dunn placed the knife blade against the employee's throat and ordered her to open the register. The employee complied, but Dunn elected not to take any money. Instead, he began dragging the female employee out of the store. When the woman struggled, Dunn told her to stop, threatening, quote, "I'll gut you like a fish." End quote. Thankfully, 2 customers sprang into action and a struggle ensued between all 4, resulting in Dunn releasing the woman and fleeing the scene. The clerk and the 2 customers would later identify Dunn as the attacker, and during trial, the prosecution worked hard to show that Dunn had a history of similar assaults. On July 5, 1982, Dunn was 17 years old when he forced his way into a Volkswagen camper van at a campground south of Hood River. Inside, a couple were sleeping when Dunn pointed his rifle at the husband, telling him he'd blow his head off if he moved. He then ordered the man's wife to leave the van with him. At some point, Dunn became distracted, and the man was able to get his hands on the rifle. Dunn fled to a waiting vehicle, but was later arrested and charged only with a juvenile burglary charge, which never even went before a judge. Dunn was placed on house arrest for several years before he was ultimately found guilty in the 1997 crime, when in 2002 he was sentenced to 7 years and 4 months in prison. However, receiving credit for time served under house arrest, Dunn could only face a maximum of 2.5 years behind bars. Considering the sharp similarity between the crime for which he was convicted and the abduction of Becky, investigators worked hard to link Dunn to that crime, but never managed to obtain the evidence necessary to do so. 5 years later, on July 2, 2007, Oak Ridge, Oregon police officer Steve Ball initiated a traffic stop at approximately 11:30 p.m. The driver of the vehicle, an SUV, was Dunn, and he'd been pulled over for speeding and driving with defective taillights. During the stop, Officer Bell found a firearm hidden in a holster under a jacket on Dunn's passenger seat. Being a former felon, he wasn't allowed to own a firearm, so Ball informed him that he would be arrested. At that time, Dunn engaged the officer in a struggle, and when he turned to grab the gun from beneath the jacket, Ball fired on the man, killing him. A subsequent search of the vehicle confirmed the presence of a .44 Magnum revolver and a rifle. Neither weapon was loaded at the time, though ammunition for both was found at Dunn's apartment later that evening. An autopsy would show that Dunn had cocaine in his system and a blood alcohol content level of 0.21, more than 2.5 times the legal limit. Just days before this traffic stop, Dunn had been arrested for driving under the influence and his license had been removed. Unfortunately, any information Dunn may have possessed about Becky's abduction, if indeed he was the suspect, went to the grave with him. 6 months prior to Dunn's death, January of 2007 marked 10 years since Becky had been abducted. Speaking to the Register Guard, Detective Tracy Belshie revealed for the first time that in the first year of the investigation, more than 1,500 leads were tracked down. Belshie explained that sadly, the majority of tips were too vague, with people claiming to have seen someone who resembled Becky, the abductor, or the truck. But in each instance where the person or truck could be located, it was never who they were looking for. To date, there has never been a confirmed sighting of Becky. Becky's sister, Chris, sat down to speak with KVAL ABC News 13 in February of 2017, 20 years after the abduction. She expressed her frustration with the inability of detectives to break the case, saying, quote, "Somewhere in that police department's basement is a box with your sister's name on it, and nobody's doing anything about it. I remember we'd count the days, and nothing would happen. Too many days to count, so we would count weeks. Too many weeks to count, now I never thought it would be counting years, but here we are." End quote. Investigators argued that they had worked the case hard, but they could never find what they needed to make an arrest. It was noted that Becky's husband, Darrell, had been ruled out early on, and while they had been able to cross a large number of names off their list, they were never able to confirm anyone as having been involved. In just 2 months, January of 2022, it will mark 24 years since the loving, bright, and dedicated mother was abducted, and it doesn't appear the answers are coming anytime soon. When last seen, Rebecca Kathleen Reid was described as being a white female with brown eyes and hair, standing 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing 120 pounds. Becky's ears are pierced, and in 1997 she wore gold wire-rimmed glasses. She was last seen wearing a turquoise pullover sweater, blue jeans, and blue and white tennis shoes. She was seen being forced into a white or light-colored compact or mid-sized pickup truck with a blue racing stripe down the side. Her abductor is a white male, with shoulder-length brown hair and a mustache, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing between 165 and 185 pounds. Becky was abducted from the grocery cart, now known as the Dairy Mart, at 1510 State Highway 99 North in Eugene, Oregon, at 1 a.m. on Monday, January 27, 1997. At the time of her abduction, Becky was 37 years old, and if alive today, she would be turning 62 next month. Next, we move on to the disappearance of Robin Monique Ellis. Robin Monique Ellis was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to parents Cornelius and Sylvia on Friday, December 16, 1955. Intelligent and compassionate, Robin's been described as a loving child and caring adult who wanted to help others and was the type to give you the shirt off her back. As a child, Robin's father worked as a mechanic while her mother was listed as being a homemaker on census documents. Tragically, in 1976, when Robin was just 20 years old, her mother passed away at the age of 37. This was obviously a devastating blow for Robin, who had been close to her mother and struggled in the aftermath. However, over the years, Robin worked hard to put her life together and to build the future she sought for herself. In September of 1987, at the age of 31, Robin gave birth to her first and only child, a son. He would quickly become the light of her life, and she dreamed of providing him with all of the things she'd never had. Unfortunately, Robin would mysteriously vanish when her son was just 16 years old. By December of 2003, Robin was living in Pennsylvania on her own, having sent her son to live with her father in Florida. At the time, Robin had purchased a house on Litchfield Street in South Philadelphia and was in the middle of having the home remodeled. She was also carrying at least 2 jobs working at different pizzerias, and according to police, she may have also been operating off the books as an unlicensed taxi driver, sometimes blending the two when she'd deliver pizzas and operate a taxi service simultaneously. On Sunday, December 7th, Robin was scheduled to work a shift as a delivery driver at the former Woodland Village Pizza, located at 63rd and Woodland Avenue in southwest Philadelphia. Depending upon which account you follow, Robin was either last seen by coworkers at approximately 5 p.m. at the pizzeria, or she was last confirmed to have been seen just before midnight transitioned from Sunday to Monday, December 8th. Either way, what we know for certain is that Robin left the pizzeria carrying the food for 4 separate deliveries, all to be completed in the local area. But she never returned to work, and only one of those orders made it to the intended destination. It doesn't appear that Robin was reported missing when she failed to return to work, and in fact, law enforcement didn't become aware of her disappearance until 2 days later when her abandoned car was found. On the morning of Tuesday, December 9th, a Pennsylvania state trooper discovered Robin's light brown/gold-colored 1995 Hyundai Elantra along the northbound side of Interstate 95 near the Academy Road exit. This would place her car approximately 17 miles northeast of Woodland Village Pizza, less than a mile from the New Jersey state line. According to investigators, the vehicle had been found with both doors locked and in good condition. It was still operational, though the keys weren't found in or near the car and have never been located. Upon running the license plate, the trooper quickly determined that Robin was the owner, though it would soon be learned that she had neither been seen nor heard from in the previous 48 hours, and it seemed quite clear that this was the beginning of a missing persons investigation. A search of Robin's car didn't turn up any clues as to what may have happened to her, and investigators have said they've recovered no evidence of a struggle or crime in or around the car. Lieutenant Michael Chitwood, lead investigator for the Philadelphia Police, noted that looking into Robin's life, they determined neither friends nor family had heard from her in days. It was also revealed that she'd been a frequent caller to a local radio station, but hadn't called in since December 7th. Chitwood explained, quote, "This is completely out of character for this woman. It just seems that she'd vanished off the face of the earth, and there isn't a good reason why. There is no indication why she would get up and leave." End quote. Both tracking dogs and cadaver dogs were used on Robin's car, though this didn't lead to any additional information. The location where her car had been found had both a ravine nearby as well as the Delaware River, though canines could not detect either Robin's scent nor the scent of decomposition in the ravine or along the river's edge. In fact, outside of her car, the only trace of Robin from that night came when investigators interviewed one of the callers who had ordered pizza. The witness, a local woman, told investigators that a black female fitting Robin's description had delivered her food on the 7th, but none of the other 3 callers had received their meals. According to police, the total cash required for the 4 combined orders totaled less than $50, and Robin was not known to have been carrying any additional money, making robbery an unlikely motive. However, during their investigation, Detectives did discover Robin's moonlighting as an unlicensed cab driver and began theorizing that the 47-year-old may have been abducted or killed by someone who had used her service. Lieutenant Chitwood later stated to the Philadelphia Daily News, quote, "Did she pick up a wrong customer? She may have picked up the wrong person. Everyone who knows her says this is unlike her." End quote. One final strange piece of information exists that may or may not be directly linked to Robin's disappearance. In the weeks following the discovery of her car, Philadelphia police noted that her home on Litchfield Street was robbed not once, but twice. To this day, it remains unknown if the robberies were committed simply due to the fact that her home was sitting vacant and unprotected, or if maybe the person or persons responsible for abducting the single mother had done so in order to obtain something from inside of her house. Some believe that, since Robin's license and keys have never been found, the suspect may simply have gone to her home after the crime in order to grab some items to sell for cash. At the same time, it's entirely possible that Robin's disappearance occurred purely so that the suspect could gain entry to her home for a yet unknown reason. Unfortunately, this is where all traces of Robin begin growing cold, and in the 18 years since, the case has only gotten colder. Her name has been mentioned in campaigns bringing awareness to missing persons and marches for the missing, but few, if any, additional details have been released, and this is seemingly due to the fact that the investigation into her disappearance has never advanced much beyond what's already been determined. Coverage is slim, almost nil, and searching for Robin's name brings up few results. Since nearly the beginning of Trace Evidence, I've wanted to cover Robin's case. It's one that I've always been fascinated by and want to see solved. Due to the low amount of information and the Denial of Freedom of Information Act request, however, this short segment is everything I've been able to find. When last seen, Robin Monique Ellis was described as being a black female with black hair and brown eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing 115 pounds. Her ears are pierced, and she may have surgical scars on her feet. She has a light-colored birthmark on the side of her face near the temple and a tattoo of the name Sylvia on her arm. Robin sometimes used the name Monique Lee and may have moonlighted as an unlicensed cab driver. She was last seen by coworkers at Woodland Village Pizza at 63rd and Woodland Avenue on Sunday, December 7th, 2003. And her car, a brown or light gold colored Hyundai Elantra with license number FDY 7311, was found abandoned on I-95 northbound near the Academy Road exit 2 days later on Tuesday, December 9th. Robin was 37 when she vanished, and if alive today, she would be turning 56 next month. And now we move into our final case for this episode, the disappearance of Kathleen Patricia Haley. Kathleen Patricia Haley was born on Saturday, October 26, 1974, to parents Daniel Patrick and Verdia in Newport News, Virginia. Kathleen was the firstborn child, and 2 years later her younger sister Diane would join the family. Kathleen, or Kathy as she's been called, has been described by friends and family members as being extremely kind and caring with a limitless zest for life. Perhaps one of the most common traits mentioned, however, is Kathy's strong desire for privacy. She didn't share a great deal of information about her life, with even friends and close family members noting that they only knew what she would tell them, and even such information as where she worked was knowledge they didn't possess. In September of 2012, when Kathy was 37 years old, she was living in a second-floor apartment in the 2800 block of West Avenue in Newport News, right around the corner from her mother. On Saturday, September 1st, Kathy spoke to her sister Diane on the phone and was invited over for dinner. Kathy reportedly told her sister she would stop by for a while, but she couldn't stay late as she'd made plans for the evening. According to Diane, there was nothing out of the ordinary about the call, and Kathy didn't appear to be worried, concerned, or upset about anything. However, she never arrived for dinner that night and hasn't been contacted or seen by anyone since that afternoon. At first, no one thought too much about it, as according to her family, it wasn't uncommon for Kathy to drop out of contact for several days at a time. The only person she almost always spoke to, at least once and sometimes twice a week, was her mother. After that first weekend in September, Kathy was supposed to take her mother to an auto shop to have her car inspected, but she never showed up, and when the family tried contacting her, they got no answer. In some places, it's been reported that calls to Kathy's phone went straight to voicemail. However, law enforcement has never confirmed this. According to the family, after several days of not being able to locate Kathy, they placed a call to the Newport News Police Department to report her missing. In a report issued by WVEC ABC News 13, the family stated that their first call to police didn't go well, and the officer they spoke with refused to take the missing person's report. The officer reportedly told them that they had no evidence to suggest anything was wrong, noting that Kathy was an adult and could go off without telling anyone if she chose to. Frustrated, Kathy's mother and her brother-in-law, Jesus Manuel Roman, decided to go and check out her condo. Upon entering, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Kathy's car was parked out front, but she wasn't home. Several items were missing, including Kathy's beloved dog, a boxer named Molly, and the apartment itself was described as looking like a disaster zone. Asked about missing items, Manuel didn't want to go into detail for fear of damaging the investigation, explaining, quote, "It's just stuff you don't take with you if you're going on a trip. Stuff you don't necessarily take anywhere." End quote. After checking out the apartment, Kathy's family once again contacted police, and this time, the combination of the missing woman and an apartment that appeared ransacked was enough to get someone to come out and take a report, which is dated as being filed on Friday, September 7th. A detective called to investigate the scene also found the condition of the apartment and the items located inside concerning, later writing in one of his reports, quote, "It appeared there may be more to the scene than a missing person." End quote. Through both statements made by investigators and the details of the search warrant they executed on the apartment on Saturday, September 8th, several disturbing pieces of information were revealed. Firstly, it's been reported that Kathy's car was parked outside of the apartment, and interviews with neighbors showed that it hadn't moved in days. Police found the doors of the vehicle unlocked, which Kathy's family said was unusual as she was quite security conscious. Inside, the driver's seat was noted as being moved all the way back, which was strange since Kathy was just 5 feet tall and couldn't have driven in that position. There was also apparently a large piece of cardboard laid across the back seat. Kathy reportedly had a bike that she'd ride around town when not using her car, but this too was missing. Inside of the apartment, the bedroom immediately caught the attention of detectives. Police reports note that a large section of carpet had been cut out and removed from the room, but that was hardly the strange part. In addition to this chunk of carpet, Kathy's bed was missing. The box spring and mattress were gone, and a further search of the home showed that Kathy's personal computer was also missing. Detectives searching the condo also noted that Kathy's purse couldn't be found inside, and it's never been located. Perhaps more disturbing than what was missing is what was found. In the kitchen sink, there were a few glasses and open beer bottles, all of which had been growing mold, suggesting that Kathy hadn't been there for several days. The toilet seat in the bathroom had been left in the up position, as though the last person to use it may have been male. In the kitchen, police discovered a pair of rubber gloves, and in the bathroom they found 2 pairs, one in the bathtub, another lying on the floor next to it. The gloves themselves were enough to cause concern for police, but once they found blood, they began to believe that something terrible may have happened. A paper towel crumpled up in the bathroom trash had traces of blood on it, as did clothing in a basket. A report later stated that there were spots of dried blood on white socks, 1 gray bra, and 1 gray long-sleeve t-shirt. There were also spots of blood on the apartment walls, in the bedroom, and near the kitchen. Police would end up collecting 17 swabs of blood from different locations throughout the condo. Behind the building, investigators found Kathy's mattress and box spring leaning against a large dumpster. According to their reports, The mattress had several small stains on it believed to have been dried blood, but large sections of the mattress had been cut out and removed, including the entire built-in pillow top. It seemed quite clear at the time that Kathy had likely been violently removed from her apartment, and there was a high probability that she may have been killed in the building rather than having been abducted. Several neighbors later reported that in the days prior to the search, they had smelled a foul stench at the dumpsters similar to the scent of a dead animal. Canvassing the area, police spoke to several neighbors who knew Kathy, at least enough to chat for short periods of time or to say hello when they ran into her. At least one neighbor told police that days earlier, on Tuesday, September 4th, he'd seen an unidentified man at the complex. According to the witness, the unknown male approached Kathy's apartment and let himself in with a key. This was strange to the family as, with Kathy being as private as she is, they found it highly unlikely she would have given a key to anyone. In a sworn affidavit, the witness also reported that this same man was seen leaving Kathleen's apartment later that day, writing that he saw him walking down the stairs with an armful of something rolled up, possibly bedding. The witness got a good enough look at the man that police were able to put together a digital composite sketch. You can view this now in the Vodacast. The link is in the show notes. Ultimately, a second composite was also released, of the same unidentified man but viewed from a different angle. This man was described as being a white male with blonde hair, though in one composite his hair is cut short and in the other his hair comes down to his shoulders. This may be due to the fact that police found a second witness, the child of a tenant, who recognized the first composite and told investigators that she had seen the man with Kathy in the past. This witness later told ABC News that she had heard the man arguing with Kathy in her apartment previously and that she'd seen the man yelling at Kathy on more than one occasion. No one in Kathy's family was able to identify the man, nor did they think he looked familiar. Due to Kathy's notoriously tight grip on her privacy, her family wasn't able to provide investigators with a great deal of information about her personal life. They knew she worked at a bar, though they didn't know where, telling police she often left for work around 10 p.m. and didn't get home until around 3 a.m. Diane stated that her sister sometimes complained about coworkers or customers, but she never provided details like names, descriptions, or locations. Diane told the Daily Press, quote, "I think she had some difficulties with people where she worked, but nothing she said recently was concerning." End quote. She did have a boyfriend prior to her disappearance, but this man had apparently moved to Germany in August, several weeks prior to the event. According to Manuel, Kathy checked in with her mother at least twice a week, but whenever she discussed work or her life, they knew better than to ask many follow-up questions. Manuel explained, quote, "She always felt people were prying in on her and were nosy. She couldn't stand nosy people." End quote. Beyond this, her family wasn't able to offer much about who she may have spent her time with, who she may have been seeing, or what exactly she did with her free time. All they knew for certain was that it was completely out of character for Kathy to be out of touch for this long, to not move her car, and for her social media activity to stop. While police worked to try and find out anything they could about Kathy's life, her family began mass-producing missing persons flyers which they put up all around her neighborhood, wanting to ensure that people closest to her apartment were well aware that something had occurred, hoping one of them might be inspired to call in and give a tip. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, as the unknown male has never been identified, and police have never had a truly solid lead on what may have happened to Kathy or who may have been responsible. Investigators were able to determine that Kathy, at the time of her disappearance, was employed as a dancer at a gentleman's club called Headlights. This club was located in Portsmouth along George Washington Memorial Highway, approximately 23 miles from her apartment. This opened up a whole new list of possibilities, with the suspect possibly being a former customer with an obsession, a former co-worker with a grudge, or maybe someone Kathy had met through her job. Unfortunately, none of her co-workers were very helpful, as Master Detective W.B. Gordon later told ABC News, quote, "Obviously, the environment she worked at, dancing, there's some hesitation on those people that work in that environment in wanting to talk to police. but I would greatly appreciate if any of them would reach out and contact us." End quote. Sadly, this is where the investigation into Kathy's disappearance began growing cold. Investigators reported that they had sent evidence from the department out for lab analysis, but what came of those tests has never been revealed. Police have never reported whether or not there's been any activity on Kathleen's bank account, credit card, email address, Facebook, or cell phone, only saying that they obtained warrants to look into these accounts. I should note, however, that at one point, several posts, images, and conversations were deleted from Kathy's Facebook page, though whether this was done by law enforcement, her family, or perhaps the person who stole her computer is unknown. Due to the stolen computer, police also theorized it was possible Kathy had met her assailant through an online dating site or possibly a site such as Craigslist. In a final curious twist, a man claiming to be Kathleen's brother-in-law, Manuel, made several posts online about the case. In one of them, he alleged that the missing woman's dog had been located out of state in the possession of someone in Tennessee. However, all official reports of Kathleen, including her NamUs listing, still note the dog as being missing. This person, who used the same username as one of her brother-in-law's email addresses, reported that the family were planning to release more information about the case since it remained unsolved, but that has never happened. The poster also claimed that there was a person of interest in the case, though if true, that name has never been revealed. Whether these posts were truly her brother-in-law or not remains unknown. When last seen, Kathleen Patricia Haley was described as being a white female with hazel eyes and brown hair, standing 4 feet 11 inches or 5 feet tall and weighing 100 to 120 pounds. Kathleen's ears are pierced and she's usually referred to as Kathy. Kathy's dog Molly is a brown and white spotted boxer and disappeared along with her. Kathy often made her own jewelry, and at least one pair of earrings and a gemstone necklace were missing, and she may have been wearing them. Kathy has not been seen or heard from since September 1st, 2012, and the last public statements from law enforcement about her case were released in 2017, where Detective Gordon noted that they're still seeking information from Kathy's coworkers and friends, specifically for knowledge about who she socialized with, spent time with, and who she may have had problems with. Kathy lived in a second-floor apartment at 2801 West Avenue in Newport News. At the time of her disappearance, she was 37 years old, and if alive today, she would have turned 47 last month. If you're looking for more information about the vanishing of Bruce Falconer, the Bismarck Tribune has done the most extensive coverage. For details regarding the disappearances of Rebecca Reid, Robin Ellis, and Kathleen Haley, there are few sources beyond limited news articles and official listings on NamUs and missing persons websites. If you have any information about the vanishing of Bruce Falconer, please contact the Burleigh County Sheriff's Department at 701-222-6651. His case number is NDM-10115. If you have any information about the abduction of Rebecca Reid, please contact the Eugene Police Department at 541-682-5111. Her case number is 97-1923. If you have any information about the disappearance of Robin Ellis, please contact the Philadelphia Police Department at 215-686-3093. Her case number is 03-12-98891. If you have any information about the disappearance of Kathleen Haley, please contact the Newport News Police Department at 757-247-2500. Her case number is 2012-58163. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at TraceEvidencePod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Trace Evidence would not be possible without support from amazing listeners like you. And now I'd like to take a moment to thank our fantastic Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Eric Sumter, Guillerme Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jen Trebb, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Brackeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Orange Patches, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Levanon, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Adorable Susie Summers, Taylor, Tom Archer, Tom Radford, and Tracy Woods. Your contributions to Trace Evidence are invaluable, and your support of the show is both appreciated and extremely humbling. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence and gaining access to exclusive merch and ad-free episodes, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or go to trace-evidence.com and click on the support option. I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you didn't mind the small change in format. These are all cases I've been researching for years, but sadly lack enough information to give a full-length episode on. So again, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.